Sarah Bennett's Mercedes glided to a stop in the courthouse parking garage, the echo of the engine reverberating off concrete walls. 8:42 a.m. She had exactly 18 minutes before her hearing, and Judge Harrison's reputation for starting precisely on time was legendary. As she gathered her belongings, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Baby girl, don't forget about dinner tonight. Your father's birthday." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Between 3 major cases and the upcoming Bar Association leadership announcement, she'd completely forgotten. The click of her Louboutin heels echoed through the parking structure as she juggled her Italian leather briefcase, a stack of carefully prepared motions, and a grande cup of coffee from her favorite local shop, her one daily indulgence. The steam rising from the cup fogged up her tortoiseshell glasses, a minor annoyance that added to the morning's mounting pressure. At the courthouse entrance, the usual crowd of lawyers, clients, and court staff bottlenecked at the security checkpoint. Sarah noticed how several white attorneys nodded to the security guards and breezed through with barely a pause. Her jaw tightened. She knew what was coming. "ID, ma'am." The security guard's voice carried across the lobby. Sarah had been walking through these same doors for 5 years, 3 days a week, like clockwork. She'd seen this particular guard, Officer Reynolds according to his nameplate, hundreds of times. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional, as she awkwardly shifted her coffee to free up a hand. A young white attorney in a rushed suit slipped through behind her, offering only a casual wave to the guard. Sarah pretended not to notice, just as she pretended not to notice how Officer Reynolds barely glanced at her bar card before scrutinizing it against her face. "Purpose of your visit?" he asked, despite her clearly visible court files and professional attire. "Traffic hearing in courtroom 4B, Judge Harrison presiding." Sarah maintained eye contact, her expression pleasant but firm. This was a dance she knew all too well, the constant need to prove she belonged in spaces where people assumed she didn't. As she finally cleared security, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the polished marble wall. Immaculate burgundy suit, perfectly pressed white silk blouse, hair styled in a conservative twist. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "You have to look twice as good to be taken half as seriously." Even after graduating top of her class from Harvard Law, even after winning landmark cases, even after being nominated for Bar Association president, the daily microaggressions remained a constant companion. The elevator was predictably packed. Sarah squeezed in, noticing how 2 white women in business casual clutched their purses slightly tighter. She wanted to tell them that their Target bags weren't her style anyway, but instead she smiled politely and focused on not spilling her coffee. The elderly court clerk who always worked on the 3rd floor shuffled in, his arms full of files. "Here, let me help you with those, Mr. Thompson," Sarah offered, carefully balancing her own load to take some of his files. "Bless you, dear," he smiled, genuinely grateful. "Always such a kind young lady. Are you here to file some documents for one of the attorneys?" Sarah's smile didn't waver as she replied, "Actually, I'm appearing before Judge Harrison this morning. I'm the attorney of record for the Martinez case." The clerk's face flushed red. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I just assumed." "No worries at all," Sarah assured him, though the familiar sting lingered. The elevator dinged for the 4th floor, and she handed back his files. 8:57 a.m. 3 minutes to spare. As she approached courtroom 4B, Sarah straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly, a posture she perfected over years of being the only black woman in countless rooms. Through the heavy wooden doors, she could see Judge Harrison already seated at the bench, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he reviewed the morning's docket. His reputation for bias against minority attorneys was well known, though carefully disguised behind procedural strictness and high standards. Sarah Bennett took one final deep breath, shifted her briefcase to her left hand, and pushed open the courtroom doors. Time to show them exactly who she was. Judge William Harrison's courtroom ran with military precision, a reflection of his 27 years on the bench and his former service as a Marine Corps JAGE officer. The American flag behind his chair was perfectly pressed, each fold crisp and deliberate. The clock on the wall read exactly 9:00 a.m. when Sarah's heels clicked against the polished floor, 2 minutes late by his exacting standards. For the record, his voice boomed across the courtroom. It is 9:02 a.m. He made a show of writing something in his legal pad, the scratch of his Mont Blanc pen somehow louder than necessary. Ms. Bennett, I trust you have a compelling reason for delaying the proceedings of this court. The other attorneys in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Tom Patterson, a defense attorney who'd practiced before Harrison for 15 years, winced slightly. Just last week, he'd arrived 5 minutes late, and Harrison hadn't said a word. The double standard wasn't lost on anyone present. Sarah stood at the counsel table, her posture impeccable. My apologies, Your Honor. Security was particularly thorough this morning. The subtle emphasis on particularly caused a few knowing glances among the minority attorneys present. Judge Harrison peered over his wire-rimmed glasses, his steel-gray hair catching the fluorescent light. His chambers were lined with degrees from prestigious universities and photographs of him shaking hands with governors and senators. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace, and he wielded it like a weapon. Ms. Bennett, your inability to properly schedule your morning is not an excuse this court recognizes. He shuffled through his papers with deliberate slowness. I see you're representing. He paused, squinting at the document, though Sarah knew he'd memorized the entire docket hours ago. Mrs. Martinez in a routine traffic violation. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the rising tension. She reached for her briefcase, its soft leather creaking in the silent courtroom. If I may, I've prepared a motion regarding the circumstances of the traffic stop. Is your client present? Harrison interrupted, his eyes scanning the gallery where Maria Martinez sat nervously in her McDonald's uniform, clearly having rushed to court during her break. Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Martinez is. Then she can observe firsthand how her counsel's tardiness affects her case. Harrison's words cut through the air like a blade. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see an attorney of your experience handling a simple traffic matter. Surely your time would be better spent on more suitable cases. The condescension in his voice made several spectators bristle. A young law clerk in the front row furiously scribbled notes, clearly recognizing the significance of what was unfolding. Sarah maintained her composure, though her right hand gripped the edge of the counsel table slightly tighter, her Harvard law ring pressed into her finger, a reminder of every barrier she'd already broken. Your Honor, every client deserves zealous representation, regardless of the nature of their case. Mrs. Martinez works 3 jobs to support her children, and this ticket would create significant hardship. Ms. Bennett, Harrison interrupted again, his patience visibly thinning. This court's time is valuable. I'm not interested in a social justice lecture. The fact remains that your client ran a red light, as clearly documented by the traffic camera. Sarah opened her motion, her perfectly manicured finger pointing to a crucial paragraph. If you'll review the evidence, Your Honor, the yellow light at this particular intersection has been documented to last only 2.3 seconds, significantly shorter than the Department of Transportation's recommended minimum of 3.5 seconds. This creates an inevitable trap for. Enough. Harrison's gavel cracked against the sound block. This court is not interested in your theories about traffic light conspiracies. Your client violated Section 375.2 of the Traffic Code. The fine is $500, due within 30 days. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The standard fine was $200, and everyone knew it. Sarah straightened her spine, years of experience helping her maintain a neutral expression despite the blatant abuse of judicial discretion. Very well, Your Honor. Her voice carried clearly across the courtroom. For the record, I'd like to note my objection to both the amount of the fine and the court's refusal to hear mitigating evidence. Harrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. Noted. Next case. As Sarah gathered her documents, she could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Some sympathetic, some curious, but all knowing they'd just witnessed something significant. Little did Judge Harrison know, this wasn't just another Tuesday in traffic court. By this afternoon, everything would change. The tension in courtroom 4B had reached a fever pitch. Maria Martinez sat in the gallery, nervously twisting her McDonald's name tag between her fingers, her work shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Sarah could feel her client's anxiety radiating across the room as she prepared for what came next. "Your Honor," Sarah's voice cut through the heavy air, "I move for reconsideration of the fine amount." She pulled out a meticulously prepared document from her briefcase. Several veteran attorneys exchanged glances. They'd never seen anyone challenge Harrison's initial ruling, especially not in traffic court. Judge Harrison's face darkened like storm clouds gathering. "Ms. Bennett, I believe I made myself clear. Or perhaps they didn't cover basic courtroom procedure at whatever institution granted you your law degree." Sarah's smile was razor sharp. "Harvard Law, Your Honor. Class of 2012, magna cum laude." And yes, they covered procedure quite thoroughly. She pushed forward, her voice steady. "Including a defendant's right to due process and equal protection under the law." The young law clerk in the front row had stopped pretending to write and was now openly staring. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled on her stenotech machine. "Are you suggesting something, Ms. Bennett?" Harrison's knuckles whitened around his gavel. "Not suggesting, Your Honor. I'm stating facts." Sarah pulled out a stack of printouts. "I have here the last 6 months of traffic citations from this court. The average fine for a first-time red light violation is $200. In fact, just this morning, you assigned a $150 fine to Mr. Davidson for the same offense." She paused deliberately. The only apparent difference being Mr. Davidson's demographic profile. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the courtroom. Tom Patterson dropped his pen, and it clattered loudly against the wooden bench. Judge Harrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Ms. Bennett, you are dangerously close to contempt of court." "Perhaps, Your Honor." Sarah remained perfectly composed, but on even closer to filing a detailed complaint about systematic bias in sentencing patterns. She gestured to her client. "Mrs. Martinez works 3 jobs: breakfast shift at McDonald's, afternoon receptionist at the dental clinic, and night cleaning at the university. The camera caught her at 5:43 a.m. as she was rushing to open the restaurant. A $500 fine is more than a week's wages." Maria Martinez sat straighter in her seat, chin trembling but head held high. Sarah continued, her words measured and precise. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the traffic camera at this intersection has been the subject of multiple complaints. The yellow light timing." "Enough." Harrison's gavel crashed down so hard that the sound block cracked. "Ms. Bennett, your theatrics may impress your usual clientele, but in my courtroom—" "In your courtroom, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "the law should be applied equally, regardless of race, gender, or social status." She placed another document on the counsel table. "I've taken the liberty of preparing a formal motion for judicial review, complete with statistical analysis of sentencing disparities in your traffic court over the past year." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, not just another attorney to be dismissed, but a formidable opponent who had come armed for war. "I assume," Sarah continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent courtroom, "that you'd prefer to adjust the fine to the standard amount rather than have these statistics become part of the public record." For a moment, no one breathed. Judge Harrison's face went through a remarkable series of colors before settling into a rigid mask of judicial propriety. "Given the additional context provided, this court will amend the fine to $200. His voice could have frozen hell over. "But Ms. Bennett, don't think this performance will be forgotten." Sarah gathered her documents with careful precision. "I'm counting on it, Your Honor." She turned to Maria Martinez. "Mrs. Martinez, you can pay the fine at the clerk's office. I believe they take installment payments." Then, facing the bench one last time, Sarah's smile was pure steel. "Thank you for your consideration, Your Honor. I look forward to seeing you at the Bar Association meeting this afternoon." As she strode out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor like exclamation points, Sarah didn't need to look back to know she'd left chaos in her wake. Let Harrison stew on that last comment. In a few hours, he'd understand exactly who he'd been attempting to humiliate. The Windsor Hotel's Crystal Ballroom had hosted state governors, Supreme Court justices, and even a president or two in its storied history. This afternoon, it was home to the quarterly State Bar Association leadership meeting, where Judge William Harrison expected to hold court among his peers just as he did from the bench. Straightening his bow tie, a subtle display of power in navy silk, Harrison strode through the ornate double doors at 2:57 p.m. The familiar faces of the state's legal elite turned toward him, but something was off. The usual sycophantic smiles were replaced with knowing looks and poorly concealed smirks. William Charles Whitman II, managing partner of the state's largest law firm, intercepted him. "I trust your morning session was enlightening." There was something in Charles's tone that made Harrison's stomach tighten. Before he could respond, the room's attention shifted. Sarah Bennett swept in through the side entrance, having transformed from her morning courtroom attire into a stunning ivory power suit. The afternoon sun streaming through the crystal chandeliers caught the gold pin on her lapel, the Bar Association's highest honor for excellence in leadership. Harrison froze mid-step, his perfectly polished Oxford leaving a scuff on the marble floor. Sarah wasn't just attending the meeting. She was walking directly to the head of the massive mahogany table, where a leather portfolio and nameplate awaited. The golden letters caught the light. Sarah Bennett, President, State Bar Association. "Ah, yes." Charles's voice dripped with barely concealed amusement. "I don't believe you've been formally introduced to our new president. Youngest in state history. Unanimous vote last week, though you missed that meeting, if I recall. She's been absolutely revolutionary in her proposals for judicial reform." The blood drained from Harrison's face so quickly that a nearby junior partner almost offered him a chair. The morning's events played back in his mind like a horror film. Every interruption, every condescending remark, every abuse of power, now magnified 1,000-fold. "Good afternoon, colleagues." Sarah's voice carried effortlessly across the room, commanding attention without demanding it. "Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our newest committee member, Judge Harrison, who'll be joining our initiative on judicial bias and equal access to justice." Her smile was professionally pleasant, but her eyes held the weight of the morning's confrontation. Harrison's legs carried him automatically to his assigned seat, notably far from the head of the table. His name card seemed to mock him. Committee member. Just hours ago, he had been the one looking down from on high. Now, as he sank into his chair, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "As you can see from the agenda," Sarah continued, distributing leather-bound portfolios with practiced ease, "our first order of business is reviewing the statistical analysis of sentencing disparities across our district courts." She paused, her gaze meeting Harrison's. Judge Harrison has some particularly relevant experience in this area from his traffic court proceedings. Several committee members coughed to hide their laughter. News traveled fast in legal circles, and Harrison's morning performance had apparently preceded him. He could feel the heat rising in his collar as Sarah smoothly guided the meeting forward. "We'll be implementing new guidelines for fine structures, ensuring consistency across demographic groups." Sarah's presentation was flawless, each point illustrated with the same meticulous attention to detail she demonstrated in his courtroom. "Our data shows some concerning patterns that require immediate attention." The PowerPoint slide clicked to a familiar graph, the exact same statistical analysis Sarah had threatened him with that morning. His own courtroom's numbers were highlighted in glaring red. "Of course," Sarah added, her voice carrying just the right note of professional concern. "We're fortunate to have Judge Harrison's perspective on these numbers. I'm sure he'll be instrumental in helping us understand how such disparities might inadvertently occur." Harrison reached for his water glass with a trembling hand, nearly knocking it over. The crystal caught the light, reminding him of how quickly fortunes could change, how easily the mighty could fall. Just this morning, he had been the one wielding power like a weapon. Now he sat in silence as Sarah Bennett, the woman he had tried to humiliate, commanded the respect of every power player in the state's legal community. The meeting had barely begun, but already Judge William Harrison knew his world would never be the same. The Windsor Hotel's Crystal Ballroom had transformed into Sarah Bennett's command center. For 2 hours, she orchestrated a masterclass in leadership that left even her harshest critics nodding in approval. Judge Harrison sat in his leather chair, a spectator to his own undoing, as Sarah systematically dismantled decades of systemic bias under the guise of procedural reform. "Our next agenda item," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the same quiet authority she'd shown in traffic court, addresses the implementation of mandatory bias training for all judicial officers. She pulled up a series of graphs on the projection screen. "Our research indicates that unconscious bias affects approximately 67% of courtroom decisions, particularly in cases involving minority defendants and traffic violations." Harrison's tie felt like a noose. The statistical analysis on the screen might as well have been his own portrait in numbers. Every discriminatory fine, every dismissive comment, every abuse of power quantified in devastating detail. "Judge Reynolds from the Ninth Circuit has volunteered to chair this initiative," Sarah continued, nodding to a distinguished black judge who'd broken his own share of barriers. "He'll be working closely with our committee members to develop comprehensive training protocols." Charles Whitman II, who'd previously dismissed such training as politically correct nonsense, was now leaning forward intently. "Fascinating approach, Madam President. Have you considered expanding this to include law enforcement interactions?" "Excellent suggestion, Charles." Sarah's smile was genuine. "In fact, I had a rather illuminating experience with courthouse security this morning that highlights the need for institutional change at every level." Several committee members glanced at Harrison, their expressions a mix of schadenfreude and professional interest. His earlier performance in traffic court had apparently become the day's cautionary tale. Sarah smoothly transitioned to her next point, pulling up a proposal that made Harrison's blood run cold. "Our analysis of fine structures across the state reveals concerning patterns." The screen displayed a familiar intersection, the one from Mrs. Martinez's case. "We've discovered that certain traffic cameras are predominantly placed in minority neighborhoods, with yellow light timing set below Department of Transportation guidelines." The room erupted in murmurs. Judge Reynolds leaned back, fixing Harrison with a knowing look. "Sounds like a potential civil rights issue, Madam President." Perhaps Judge Harrison could share his insights, given his extensive experience with traffic cases. All eyes turned to Harrison, who struggled to maintain his judicial composure. Sarah saved him from immediate response by continuing her presentation, but the damage was done. His reputation for maintaining high standards was being expertly reframed as what it truly was: systematic discrimination. "We're implementing a new oversight committee," Sarah announced, her voice carrying no hint of personal victory, despite the devastating precision of her attack. "Every judge's sentencing patterns will be reviewed quarterly for disparities. We're also establishing a community advisory board to ensure our reforms actually serve the public's needs." A senior partner from a prestigious firm raised his hand. "This is impressive work, Madam President, but the cost of implementation will be significantly less than the potential civil rights lawsuits we're preventing." Sarah finished smoothly. She clicked to the next slide, displaying a budget breakdown that made even the most hardened fiscal conservatives nod in approval. "Additionally, we've secured private funding from 3 major foundations interested in judicial reform." As the meeting progressed, Harrison watched his colleagues fall under Sarah's spell one by one. She wasn't just presenting ideas. She was reshaping the entire legal landscape. Every proposal was meticulously researched, every potential objection anticipated and countered before it could be raised. "Before we conclude," Sarah said, checking her Cartier watch, a gift from her parents upon making partner, "I'd like to announce our new mentorship program for minority law students. Judge Harrison has graciously volunteered to be one of our first mentors." Harrison's head snapped up. He hadn't volunteered for anything, but Sarah's tone left no room for objection. The irony of the morning's events hung heavy in the air. "After all," she continued, her gaze meeting his directly for the first time since the meeting began, "who better to demonstrate how perspective and understanding can evolve?" The message was clear: adapt or become obsolete. As the meeting adjourned and committee members crowded around Sarah to offer congratulations, Harrison remained seated, suddenly understanding that he was witnessing more than just a changing of the guard. He was seeing the future of justice itself, and it looked nothing like his past. The sun had long since set when Judge William Harrison finally left his chambers. The courthouse halls were silent except for the distant hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum, the same crew that included night workers like Maria Martinez. He realized with a sudden pang of awareness. He sat heavily in his leather chair, the one that had seemed so throne-like this morning. His computer screen's harsh glow illuminated the office, casting shadows across his wall of achievements. Degrees, awards, commendations. Each one now seemed to mock him with what they'd failed to teach: basic human dignity. His phone buzzed again, the fifth news alert about Sarah Bennett's historic appointment. He finally clicked on one. Breaking. Sarah Bennett makes history as youngest State Bar Association president. Harvard Law graduate and civil rights attorney Sarah Bennett, 35, becomes the first black woman to lead the State Bar Association. Known for her groundbreaking work in judicial reform and equal access to justice, Bennett's appointment marks a significant shift in the state's legal landscape. Harrison's hand trembled as he scrolled through her accomplishments. Editor of Harvard Law Review, Supreme Court clerkship, multiple landmark civil rights victories. She had argued before the U.S. Supreme Court twice before the age of 30. His own prejudice had blinded him so completely that he treated one of the state's most accomplished attorneys like a novice in traffic court. He opened his court calendar software, something he'd done thousands of times before. But tonight, he started looking at the names differently. He began cross-referencing fines and sentences, creating his own spreadsheet with trembling fingers. The pattern emerged with horrifying clarity. The same bias Sarah had presented in her meeting, but this was his own record, documented in black and white. The cleaning lady appeared in his doorway, startling him. "Sorry, Judge Harrison, I can come back." "No, please," he gestured for her to enter. For the first time in 27 years, he really looked at her. "What's your name?" "Rosa, sir, Rosa Hernandez." She clutched her cleaning supplies closer, obviously uncomfortable with the attention. "How long have you worked here, Rosa?" 12 years, sir. This and 2 other jobs." Her eyes darted to the door. Harrison felt something crack inside him. "Like Mrs. Martinez," he muttered. "Excuse me, sir." "Nothing." He shook his head. "Please carry on. And thank you for your work." Rosa's surprise at being acknowledged was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. After she left, Harrison pulled up the traffic court transcript from that morning. His own words stared back at him. Perhaps they didn't cover basic courtroom procedure at whatever institution granted you your law degree. He minimized the transcript and opened a new browser tab, searching for judicial bias training resources. The results were overwhelming. Articles, studies, workshops, an entire field of research he'd dismissed as unnecessary throughout his career. He started reading, taking notes with the same intensity he'd once applied to his law school studies. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email from the Bar Association. The subject line made his stomach clench. "Mandatory bias training schedule. Response required." Sarah hadn't wasted any time. The first session was scheduled for next week, and his name was listed as both participant and future facilitator. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his reflection ghostly in the darkened window. The man who'd walked into traffic court this morning, confident in his power, secure in his prejudices, seemed like a stranger now. The weight of decades of unchecked bias pressed down on him like a physical force. He opened his email and began to type. Dear Ms. Bennett, I understand that a simple apology is insufficient given the circumstances. However, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss how I can be most effective in supporting your initiatives for reform. He paused, deleted Ms. Bennett, and replaced it with Madam President. Then he deleted the entire thing. Empty words wouldn't fix this. Action would. Instead, he opened the statistical analysis from the Bar Association meeting and began a detailed review of his own court records. If he was going to change, he needed to fully understand what he was changing from. The night stretched ahead, filled with uncomfortable truths and long overdue revelations. For the first time in his career, Judge William Harrison prepared to judge himself. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that follows a sleepless night of soul-searching. Judge Harrison stood in the marble lobby of the Bar Association building at 7:30 a.m., clutching a leather portfolio filled with his night's work, spreadsheets, analysis, and a handwritten list of every case where he suspected his bias had affected his judgment. Sarah Bennett's corner office commanded a view of the state capitol, its windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Her assistant, a young man with dreadlocks and an impeccable suit, regarded Harrison with cool professionalism. Judge Harrison for Ms. Bennett, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of yesterday's authority, though it felt hollow now. Madam President will see you now, the assistant corrected gently, standing to open the office door. Sarah sat at her desk, already deep into her morning's work. Multiple monitors displayed email chains, court documents, and what appeared to be draft legislation. A fresh copy of the morning's paper lay on her desk, her appointment making front-page news. Judge Harrison. She didn't stand. I must admit, I didn't expect to see you quite so soon. Her tone was professional, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. Ms. Ben. Madam President, he corrected himself, remaining standing until she gestured to a chair. I spent the night reviewing my records. All of them. One eyebrow arched slightly. 5 years' worth. He opened his portfolio, hands slightly shaking. I found patterns that disturbed me deeply. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. The morning sun cast her in silhouette, a position of power she'd earned rather than inherited. I'm not interested in your guilt, Judge Harrison. Guilt doesn't create change. No, he agreed, pulling out his spreadsheets. But data does. I've identified 147 cases where my sentencing showed clear bias. I've drafted a proposal for review and potential remediation. This caught her attention. Sarah leaned forward, accepting the documents he offered. Her eyes scanned the pages quickly, professionally. You did this all last night. I needed to understand, really understand. He swallowed hard. I also spoke with the night cleaning crew for the first time in 27 years. Actually spoke with them, learned their names, their stories. Performative enlightenment isn't the goal here, Judge Harrison. I know. He pulled out another document. That's why I've also drafted my resignation. No. Sarah's voice cut through the air like a gavel strike. I'm sorry. Resignation is the easy way out. It's what privileged men do when they're caught being privileged men. She stood, walking to her window. Do you know why I took that traffic court case yesterday? Harrison remained silent, waiting. Because Mrs. Martinez reminded me of my mother, working multiple jobs, trying to keep everything together. And then one traffic ticket threatens to unravel it all. She turned back to face him. I don't need your resignation, Judge Harrison. I need your commitment. To what? To being uncomfortable, to sitting in rooms where you're not the most powerful person, to listening to people you've spent a career talking over. She returned to her desk, pulling up a calendar. The bias training starts next week, but that's just the beginning. What else? You'll mentor 3 minority law students. You'll volunteer at the legal aid clinic twice a month. You'll serve on the community oversight board, not as chair, but as a member. And you'll do it all without expecting praise or recognition. Harrison felt the weight of each requirement, but also their purpose. Yes. Yes. What? Yes, Madam President. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Your homework from last night. It's a start. But understanding the past isn't enough. We need to change the future. I want to help. I know. She pressed a button on her phone. Marcus, please bring in the Community Advisory Board proposal. To Harrison, she added, we have work to do. As Marcus entered with more documents, Harrison realized something profound. This wasn't about redemption or even forgiveness. It was about justice, real justice, the kind that required constant work and conscious change. One more thing, Sarah said, her voice carrying that same quiet authority from the courtroom. Mrs. Martinez is fine. Consider it paid. I don't understand. You will. She handed him a thick binder. Now let's talk about real justice reform. And so, in that sunlit office high above the city, 2 very different people began building a bridge across decades of bias, not with grand gestures or empty apologies, but with spreadsheets, proposals, and the hard work of genuine change. 6 months later, Courtroom 4B had transformed. Gone was the intimidating silence, replaced by a quiet hum of respectful efficiency. Judge William Harrison, his hair slightly grayer but his eyes clearer, sat on the bench watching his former self's kingdom crumble and something better rise in its place. Next case, he called, his voice carrying none of its former imperial weight. A young black attorney approached the podium, barely containing her nervousness. 6 months ago, Harrison would have seized on that weakness. Today, he simply smiled encouragingly. Your Honor, she began, I'm Lisa Washington, representing Mr. Torres in a traffic violation dispute. In the gallery, Sarah Bennett sat quietly observing, her presence both a reminder and a promise. She'd made it a point to attend random court sessions across the state, ensuring the reforms weren't just paperwork and promises. Ms. Washington. Harrison nodded. I believe this is your first appearance in traffic court. His tone was genuine, interested rather than accusatory. Yes, Your Honor. I'm part of the Bar Association's new mentorship program. Harrison felt a familiar twist in his gut. She was one of his mentees, though Sarah had orchestrated the assignments with deliberate irony. Please proceed. As Lisa presented her case, Harrison noticed the small changes that had reshaped his courtroom. The newly installed multilingual signage, the court interpreter standing ready, the modified fine schedule that accounted for income levels. Each change represented a battle, a lesson, a step toward justice. During the lunch recess, he walked through the courthouse halls with new awareness. Officer Reynolds, the security guard who had once demanded Sarah's ID daily, was attending his 3rd cultural sensitivity training. The cleaning crew, Rosa, Miguel, and Jun, greeted him by name, no longer scurrying away when he passed. In his chambers, Harrison reviewed the latest statistics from the Bar Association. Traffic fine disparities had dropped 47% across the state. The mentorship program had placed 50 minority law students in prestigious clerkships. Mrs. Martinez, whose case had sparked this revolution, was now in her 1st semester of law school, her tuition partly funded by a scholarship program Harrison had quietly established. A knock at his door interrupted his reverie. Sarah Bennett entered, carrying a familiar leather portfolio. Your quarterly review, Judge Harrison. She placed the documents on his desk. The numbers are impressive. The work isn't finished, he replied, a phrase that had become almost a mantra. It's never finished. Sarah took a seat, her authority now so natural it required no performance. But change is happening. The state Supreme Court just adopted our bias training program as mandatory for all judges. Harrison nodded, remembering his own first training session. The discomfort, the defensiveness, the gradual awakening. He'd since become a facilitator, sharing his story with other judges who reminded him uncomfortably of his former self. The American Bar Association called. Sarah continued. They want us to present our reform model at the national conference. I think you should lead the presentation. Me? Harrison blinked in surprise. Surely you. They need to hear it from someone who's lived both sides. Sarah cut in. From someone who proves change is possible. Before Harrison could respond, his afternoon calendar reminder chimed. Legal Aid Clinic, 2:00 p.m. What had started as a mandatory obligation had become the highlight of his week. Go, Sarah smiled, recognizing the reminder tone. Mrs. Torres is coming in today, isn't she? Lisa's client from this morning. Harrison gathered his coat. Her son wants to be a judge. I thought I might talk to him about what that really means now. As he left his chambers, Harrison passed the wall where his degrees and awards had once hung. They'd been replaced by something more meaningful. A collection of thank you notes from mentees, a photograph of the first graduating class of the new scholarship program, and at the center, a framed copy of the traffic court transcript from that fateful morning with Sarah. A daily reminder of how far he'd come and how far he had to go. In the lobby, he held the door for a young black attorney rushing to court, her arms full of files. She started to show her ID to security, but Officer Reynolds just smiled and waved her through. Good afternoon, counselor. Harrison caught Sarah's eye across the lobby. She nodded once, a small gesture carrying the weight of revolution. The old power structures were crumbling, replaced by something far more valuable. Justice that truly lived up to its name. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But in courtroom 4B and beyond, change wasn't just possible. It was happening. One case, one day, one mind at a time.